Thank you so much for attending this presentation. Really hope you all are having a great time at the meeting. I'd like to extend my gratitude to Dr. McCabe for inviting me to talk about the different landowners that are creating pollinator habitats on their properties. This presentation is going to cover landowners, neighbors, ecology, and regulations, the hurdles that are encountered when people are creating pollinator habitats. So the landowners that are creating pollinator habitats can really be broken down into two different groups, and that is the landowners that are excited to do the work because they care about pollinators, and then the other group which is doing it because regulatory requirements for some action that they want to do. For both situations, it's important to consider the landscape, the context, the neighbors, and the regulations that are going to oversee the pollinator habitat, the installation, and the maintenance of those areas. Obligated landowners typically are navigating multiple regulations simultaneously, including the Federal Endangered Species Act, state regulations, county ordinances, and any of the government agencies that are overseeing their primary goal of the land activity that they're doing. Typically, one of those groups is going to be requiring a pollinator habitat be installed on that property, and this can lead to some positive outcomes. So because the entities are not necessarily well versed in either the regulations or the pollinator habitats, they're going to hire a consultant to navigate both the regulations and creating the pollinator habitat. As long as the firm that they're hiring has competent pollinator ecologists, the pollinator habitat can be built very well, and the company is typically just going to take the recommendation and move forward. They're not going to have a lot of questions. This allows for large pollinator habitats to be created and protected, sometimes for decades, and less often, but still sometimes in perpetuity, depending on the agreements that have been reached by the agencies. It also takes less work to educate these landowners, again, simply because they're worried about the regulation benchmarks. They're not necessarily worried about creating good pollinator habitat, which leads to some of the negative sides. They're not interested in actually creating habitat for pollinators. They're interested in checking off boxes for the regulations. Another downside is that managing these kinds of projects and hiring consultants is costly, and this often leads to negative opinions of environmental regulations, which many of us understand are important for our communities to stay healthy. Another downside is that large pollinator habitats can be created, but they can be managed poorly. So if there's no regulations covering when to mow or what can be applied to the land in addition to the actual seeding, it can lead to habitats that are mowed in the middle of July, which harms their pollinators, or pesticides are applied, or other activities that simply are just going to harm the pollinators. This is because the pollinator habitats in these situations can only be as good as the regulations and the enforcement that comes with it. Willing landowners, on the other hand, typically are spending their own money and not looking for a return on their investment. And they're also interested in creating robust, healthy habitats, moreover than they are checking off those regulatory boxes. There are groups that could be considered willing landowners, but that's because they're enrolling in a financial incentive, but they're going to behave more like the obligated landowners. So we'll leave those in the previous group. Willing landowners bring a lot of excitement to the table, which is always wonderful, and they want to create that good habitat, and they're amenable to recommendations. As science learns new things, they want to implement them pretty quickly, which is exciting. They're going to create small to large pollinator habitats. This can be just a small, less than 1/10 of an acre to multi-100-acre projects, depending on how much land they own, and they're going to want to manage it well. They're also willing to learn, and they're bound by less regulatory oversight, typically not needing to be concerned about the Federal Endangered Species Act or the State Endangered Species Act, but in some cases those do apply. They're also willing to create more diverse habitats, whereas the obligatory landowners quite often use copy-paste type habitat management plans if their projects are close together. On the downsides with your willing landowners is that putting in these pollinator habitats is costly, and it often furthers urban inequalities. Pollinator habitats can be created, but the landowner might want to manage it for things other than just the pollinators and choose, say, honeybees, which are pollinators, but they're non-native and can cause pathogen spillover along with a few other problems. Another downside is that landowners that want to create good pollinator habitat are often researching and learning misinformation, and they're not necessarily controlling the information that they're digesting for the area that they're in. So I've had to deal with landowners that have learned about beekeeping, solitary beekeeping from England, and it's not really translating to them in Southern California. And it takes a little bit of hand holding to not offend those landowners and get them back onto the right page in their area. Lastly, willing landowners are typically going to be suburban or urban areas, and they're going to have to deal with county and city ordinances. And sometimes homeowners associations become a problem as well. Now, both types of landowners can enroll in certification programs, and there are nationwide programs like those run through Pollinator Partnership. Monarch Way Station is another good example. There's statewide programs that are typically run out of university extension offices. And then there are ones that are run through some of the pollinator organizations that exist in both North America and the United States. But none of these necessarily are going to meet the biological needs of any of those wildlife species. But they're also, most importantly, not meeting any federal or state regulatory benchmarks that are necessary for those obligatory landowners to keep their permits moving forward. Now, there are certification programs that were designed with regulations in mind. One of the more famous ones is the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP land, which does create really good habitat in agricultural lands. A more recent program that has come up is the Monarch Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. Now, this is a program that is for the monarch butterfly. It costs entities about $15,000 a year. It involves a lot of monitoring. It involves habitat plans, and it is designed to create habitat and hopefully help the monarch butterfly out. Projects that aim to help species specifically is awesome, but when a species is already a candidate for the Federal Endangered Species Act, this can be dangerous. And that's because during the time in which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is reviewing this species, if these programs are successful and start to rebound that population, there is no assurance those programs will continue to move forward in the future once the decision has come through to not list the species. That leaves that species open to going extinct. We know from the historical data that when a species is listed, 96% of them have stayed alive. That's fantastic. Where the species that have not been listed and have been endangered and called out by biologists as likely to go extinct, many have gone extinct. So when you compare the organisms that have gone extinct that were not listed, it is a much larger list than the number of species listed that did not go extinct. So we know that the Endangered Species Act does, in fact, work. And we don't want to subvert it with some of these things and need to keep that in mind. Now, in both the certifications and the programs that were designed for regulations, in my experience, all of them tend to leave out the ecosystem and prioritize the habitat, specifically the plant community that exists. And they want to call that plant community pollinator habitat. But these plant communities ignore the nutrient cycle, they ignore the non-plant resources, the soil diversity, in the context of how these habitats come into existence and would go out of existence naturally gets lost as well. When I'm dealing with willing landowners and some of the research that I do, I try and highlight that in forested ecosystems specifically, which is about 2/3 of the United States, that if you were to look at a naturally occurring herbaceous community, a year before that comes into existence, it's typically going to come from a fire, and some type of ecosystem engineer or massive disturbance is going to come through that moves that one vegetation community into an herbaceous plant community. As landowners start to wrap their heads around this, I then start to bring into the fact that these meadows are typically short-lived themselves and only exist for about 25 years before they fully succeed to a shrubland, and then about 80 years before they're a younger forest. As landowners wrap their head around that, then I can introduce them that the habitat they're creating needs more than just plants. It needs the old wood that should be there, because that forest, when it died or shifted, it left a bunch of standing wood that is important for a number of pupating insects, it's important for bee nests, and it's important for nutrient cycles as well. Fallen logs, similarly, are important, and trying to get landowners to bring these into their gardens is pretty easy once they wrap their head around this. Now, obligatory landowners don't care about this at all because it's not going to check off anything on their regulations because those regulatory programs ignore the habitat as it exists within the ecosystem. Moving beyond pollinator habitat and talking more about ecosystem management, it's, like I said, harder to get obligated landowners to care or even adopt plans that renew these necessary resources. Whereas excited landowners are more willing to understand these nuances and take the time to learn about stem nesting boxes, how often they need to clean them, what's the appropriate design, how to modify soils for ground nesting bees, and all of those things. They're also more willing to monitor populations because when we start to suspend habitat succession, we are going to start creating problems with the natural enemies, and we'll get to that in just a second. But first, I want to talk about metapopulations. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this paper, in 1995, Hansky et al. Studied the Glanville fritillary, and they realized that they could take the range of this butterfly and break up that area into isolated habitats. They then were able to go out and, instead of doing very intensive surveys counting these butterflies, simply going to each of these habitats and marking as inhabited or non-inhabited. And they did this over the course of the years to find out what would be a suitable percentage of habitat to be occupied from year to year to make sure the population was in fact healthy. In doing so, they were also collecting data that was showing that some of these habitats were inhabited consistently throughout time, and a number of these habitats were also quite often having localized extirpations from year to year. So one of the hypotheses was that where there was localized extirpations was occurring in areas where the pollinator habitat wasn't necessarily the greatest or was on the fringe. Once they analyzed their data, however, they realized that the areas that had the most host plants and floral resources, the areas that they thought were great habitat, the areas that we arguably are trying to emulate with our pollinator gardens, are the ones that had the highest likelihood of those localized extinctions. And that was because these two parasitoids were able to have 100% success rate in finding the caterpillars. In the less dense host plant areas or the areas with less floral resources, the idea is that the caterpillars are spread out enough through the landscape that the parasitoids are having a problem finding all of them, and that allowed the populations to persist from year to year. So when landowners are creating these really good pollinator habitats, whether they are the obligatory landowner or the willing landowner, it's important to understand that they're actually creating really good habitat, which is most likely going to be creating habitat for the natural enemies of our pollinators and not necessarily the pollinators themselves. When the willing landowners have designed these beautiful areas and they start to understand that the clumped floral resources or the clumped host plants and the dense floral resources are in fact going to support natural enemies, they're generally more willing to monitor and try and control natural enemy buildup inside of these areas. Sometimes this includes needing to trim back host plants throughout the years so that they aren't getting laid eggs on, and if the eggs do show up, then bringing those caterpillars inside and trying to keep them away from the natural enemies. It is important to remember that no matter where we are creating pollinator habitat in the world, that it exists within inside of an ecosystem that typically would be experiencing succession. In our managed pollinator habitats, we are suspending that succession. And for the obligatory landowners, in my experience, their biggest concern is woody plant encroachment because they are trying to simply maintain the floral plant list that was in their pollinator plan. In contrast, the excited landowners are going to have a larger plant diversity that they select from, and they're trying to create better three-dimensional structures. So with willing landowners, I try and remind them that no matter which ecosystem that they are in, there are going to be picturesque landscapes that they can use as inspiration for building their garden. Once the willing landowner has decided on the type of inspiration they want to go with for creating their yard, then it's time to look at the overall context of the area that they are creating their pollinator habitat in. When I'm consulting on yards, I'll typically zoom out about this far, as you can see on the bottom right, and look at the different resources that exist in the community that the wildlife would be interacting with. In this situation, you can see that there's a few taller trees in the area, so it wouldn't necessarily be beneficial for that landowner to plant a tree unless they wanted to. It doesn't look like there's a lot of water resources, and it also doesn't look like there's a lot of landscaping in general, which is good that they're not wasting water on lawns, but it's also not great that there aren't a lot of pollinator plants in the area. So I would take this area and start to lay out a design which would have a border in the front, and I'd try and match it to anything going on the city street, which I would have to be on the ground level to make those decisions on. And then from every viewpoint, you would try and make a nice line of sight to show that this overall thing is on purpose, that it can be managed very easily, and some trimming might be necessary to keep the yard together. In contrast to this, pollinator plans that really push native plants but don't necessarily push any of the other aspects to it can come to the problems that they found in Chicago, where residents were getting ticketed because they turned their lawns into meadow type habitats by throwing native seed and letting it go. Although this can create pollinator habitat, it can also create problems for your city ordinances, your county ordinances, your homeowners association, but it's also very difficult to get into these areas and make sure that invasive species aren't taking root. Similarly, it can create habitat for feral cats, for mice, for things that people don't want in their neighborhood. So it is really important that landowners in the urban areas that want to create pollinator habitat do so in a way that is aesthetically pleasing and helpful to the pollinators that they're trying to help. When I'm working with these clients, typically I'll have to answer a lot of questions, and in my own time, I give a lot of presentations, many of which you can find on YouTube. So one of my clients actually recommended I write a book, which I did do. And that book is right here. It's available on Amazon if you want to purchase it and look it over. This book covers a lot of the things we talked about today, specifically for willing landowners. It talks about non-floral resources that are important for pollinator habitats, and it also has full species profiles on native bees, including whether or not they nest in the ground or in cavities, the types of soils they need for nesting, and ways to really facilitate ground nesting bees as well as some of the cavity nesting bees. If you don't want to purchase the book, that is also fine. I cover most of the content on the most recent publication or presentation I did for University of Mexico, which is available online as well. Simply search my last name, Makasham, and Pollinators on YouTube, and it should pop up pretty quickly. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, again, on Twitter, Gmail, or on LinkedIn. I will respond as soon as I can, and I really hope you all enjoy your time at the meeting. And enjoy the rest of the panel. Thank you all again. Have a great time.